Okay, welcome back to day 2. We are going to continue our work with sine and cosine. We're going to work on our transformations, so changing the amplitude, the period, and the phase shift. Today, our functions are generally a little bit grosser than they were yesterday or the last time that we met, quote unquote. So as you can see, we've got lots of stuff here. We have a vertical compression of 2/3. It looks like it goes up 1. It looks like there's a horizontal reflection, a compression of a 1/4, and a phase shift. It's actually pi over 8, but we're going to kind of tackle this one at a time so that we can get a graph. Explain everything is not as easy as notability. Okay, here we go. I like to start with the midline. I think generally you guys are pretty good at transformations, and you know that that +1 means that it's going to go up 1, but it's actually forgotten often. So I'm going to go ahead and just put that in there so that I remember that I have a midline at y = 1. Okay, let me erase that because I'll probably need that room. Okay, moving on. Let's figure out our amplitude, which is going to be 2/3. And you can go ahead and mark that now if you want to. So that means it's going to go 2/3 above the midline and 2/3 below the midline. So this could be 1 2/3, or what would that be, 5/3? And it's going to go below the midline at 1. If I go 2/3 below the midline, then I think I'll be at 1/3. See, just a little bit grosser than what we were working with yesterday. What I'm going to try to do, because I'll need that space, is I'm going to try to mark these maybe on this side and make them very small. Okay. Now I need to figure out my phase shift. So I'm going to take my period, which I know for cosine goes from 0 to 2 pi. And I'm going to drop this pi over 2 minus 4x. Once you've done that, you will have taken care of the horizontal compression and the move right or left. So we're going to subtract pi over 2, so we get negative pi over 2 here. And 3 pi over 2. And then I got to get rid of the negative 4, so I'm going to multiply by negative 1/4. And remember, because we're multiplying by a negative, the signs are going to flip. So I've got pi over 8 is greater than or equal to, that's not 4 pi. That should be 4x. Is greater than or equal to x is greater than or equal to negative 3 pi over 8. Okay, so that is not written well. So I'm going to rewrite negative 3 pi over 8 is less than or equal to x is less than or equal to pi over 8. Okay, there's your phase shift. It goes left 3 pi over 8. And so I'm going to make this guy just a little bit longer so that I can accommodate that. Okay, next I need my increments or my intervals. So I need my period. The period of all cosine is 2 pi. I need to divide it by the b. Now, this is written backward from the way that we learned it. So here's your b right here, the number that's attached to the x. So we're going to divide by 4. And notice that I'm using positive 4 because you wouldn't have a period that was negative. So 2 pi over 4, which gives you pi over 2. So the distance from negative 3 pi over 8 to pi over 8, that full distance is pi over 2. Okay, and now I'm going to do my increment. So I'm going to take my period and multiply it by 1/4. So it looks like I am moving in pi over 8s. So we'll start at negative, make that a little bigger, negative 3 pi over 8, and then I'll add another negative 2 pi over 8, negative 1 pi over 8, 0, and pi over 8. Okay, and that's what my inequality said. It said that we were going to start at negative 3 pi over 8, and we should end at pi over 8. Okay, and then we're just going to graph our function. So cosine starts, let me extend my midline a little bit. Okay, so cosine starts above the midline, and then I'm going to come to the midline at negative 2 pi over 8, and then I'll come down to my minimum, which is at 1/3, and then I'll come back up to my midline, and then I'll end at my pi over 8. Doesn't get any harder than that. That's about as hard as it gets. If you've got that, fantastic. Let's try question number 2. All right, kind of generally the same thing. Let's see, let's start at the midline. Our midline is at y equals negative half. It went down a half. So maybe I'll say that that's equal to 1/2. Okay, my amplitude is always a positive number. My amplitude is 3/2 or 1.5. So I'm going to go 1.5 above and below this axis. So I want you to try to pause this and go ahead and graph the height, the max and the min height of this wave, and then unpause to see if we get the same thing. Okay, so if I add 1.5 to the midline, which is at -1, I would, or negative 1/2, I would be at 1. And if I subtracted 1.5 from my midline, I think I'd be down at, let's mark this as like 2. Okay, now I'm going to work on my phase shift. Cosine goes from 0 to 2 pi, and then I'm going to drop in the 2x plus pi over 3. Subtract the pi over 3 first. That would be 6 pi over 3, so 5 pi over 3. And then I'm going to divide by 2 or multiply by 1/2. So I'm going to start at negative pi over 6, and I'm going to end up at 5 pi over 6. Okay, now we need our period. And remember, the phase shift is just that first number. It's not that whole inequality. The phase shift would be negative pi over 6. Our period is going to be 2 pi divided by the b. The b is this number right here. So we're going to be dividing by 2, which is pi. That means this function starts at negative pi over 6 and goes to 5 pi over 6. That distance should be pi. I think it is. Okay, and my increments, I'm going to take my period and I'm going to multiply it by 1/4. So I'm going to go by pi over 4s. Now this starts at pi over 6s, so let's get a common denominator of maybe 12. So I'm going to count my phase shift. If I had to make this fraction with a denominator of 12, I think that would be negative 2 pi over 12. And then I'll change these to be in terms of 12 too, so that would be 3 pi over 12. So let's see if this works. So I'm going to start at negative 2 pi over 12. And I'm adding 3 pi over 12. So if I add 3 to negative 2, I'm at 1 pi over 12. And then if I add, my increment was 3 pi over 12. So if I add another 3 pi over 12, I'm at 4 pi over 12. And then 7 pi over 12. And I should be ending at 5 pi over 6, which is the same as 10 pi over 12. Great. Okay. Sorry about that. Now, the last thing that we need to figure out before I graph this, because we've done the midline and we've done all the horizontal stuff, is I have to be careful of the negative in front of the 3/2. That we haven't assessed yet. So because cosine usually starts above the midline, in this problem, cosine is going to start below the midline at our minimum, which is at 2. And then we'll come up to the midline at 1 pi over 12. We'll head our maximum at 4 pi over 12, midline, and back to our minimum. And on your homework, you're going to be finding things, like just mentioning things like what is the amplitude, what is the phase shift, what is the period, different things like that. Okay. Here's our last one. I'd like you to try this, and then you can fast forward to the end and see if you end up with the same thing. If you're not comfortable yet to do that, go ahead and just continue watching. Okay, so there is no midline. This doesn't look like it has a vertical change, and if you want to write that, you could write y equals 0, but you don't need to. Then we'll work on the horizontal. So I know we're dealing in sine now. I know that sine goes from 0 to 2 pi and negative 2 pi x plus pi. Okay, so subtract pi from both sides. Okay, and then we are going to divide by negative 2 pi to both sides. So if I divide, we'll actually write this out, negative 2 pi, I'm going to have to flip my signs. Pi divided by negative 2 pi. My pi's are actually going to cancel, and I'm going to be left with 1/2 and negative 1/2. Let's write it the correct way. So my phase shift is negative 1/2. Okay, so my period is 2 pi. And we're going to divide that by 2 pi because our b, as you can see here, is 2 pi. So my period looks like it's going to be 1. To find the increments, we're going to take 1 and multiply it by 1/4. So it looks like I'm changing by 1/4. Okay, and then I see that my amplitude equals 4. So it's going to go 4 above and 4 below the midline, which was at 0. And it's sine, so I think I am good to go. Let's see, let's mark our increments. So we're going to start at negative 1/2, and I'm going by 1/4. So negative 1/4, 0, 1/4, 1/2, and that's what, according to this work over here, that's where I should stop, and that's where that's where I should start and stop. And it's sine, and it's not a vertical transformation, so I'm going to start on the midline, hit my maximum at negative 1/4, back to the midline, minimum, midline. Okay, your homework is the slides that follow, but it's not going to be all of them. So I feel like this first set looks like what we did at the beginning. So your homework is going to start here on question number 7. Let's start here. Okay, you do not have to find A, B, C, and D, but I do want you to find the amplitude, period, horizontal shift. That's the same as your phase shift and the vertical shift. In this particular question, you'd write none because there isn't a vertical shift. And then you go ahead and graph it. So you have 3, 6, 7 problems to do, and then Dropbox when you're done. That concludes Trig for this week. I will see you next week. Thanks, guys. Jump on the Google Meet if you have any questions.